Thank you, So-young. Our next speaker, Hilmar Farid. Hilmar has been the leading intellectual not only for Indonesia, but I think in the entire region. And Hilmar has been also leading this project of oral history for the 1965 massacre. I suspect he will address that. And he's actually moving between Jakarta and here, where he's probably, I don't know whether he will be the first PhD of cultural study in Asia. Yeah, Hilmar.
Thank you, Guanxing, for the nice introduction. Actually, this whole panel started, I think, from our discussion in Taiwan in March about the importance of including analysis and understanding of the states of emergency throughout Asia in the discussion about cultural studies, or culture in general. So I was actually the one who raised the question first. What about state of emergency? Why don't we look into it closer? And what happened afterwards was unexpected, of course. Bengwat sent me an email, why don't you talk about it? So here I'm now presenting a paper to you about state of emergency in Indonesia. The title of my paper, I'm just going to read out the whole paper, if the time allows that to do, is Perverted Normalcy, is Everyday Life in Indonesia's New Order. After 9/11, there has been a resurgence of interest in the question of emergency rule, or the state of emergency. Many governments in Europe and North America have imposed new laws which infringe the rights of individuals in certain communities that are considered a threat to national security. Just a few weeks ago, a former CIA employee by the name of Edward Snowden leaked details of US and British plans of mass surveillance programs, which basically gives both governments the authority to tap phone conversation, read emails and chats, intercept video conversations, locate whereabouts of people, and so on. It is, in short, an infringement of privacy. The methods are probably not new. We got a taste of what it is like from the Bourne movie series that started in 2002. The only difference is that under the current state of emergency, these methods are gradually made legal. From the debates about the leaked documents, it seems that regulations such as the Protect America Act of 2007 are meant to stay for a while in the legal system, which led some scholars to conclude that we are entering a permanent state of emergency. The debates around the idea of a permanent state of emergency have been largely conducted against the backdrop of the relatively stable democracies of the West. Emergency rule, which includes the suspension of the Constitution, is seen as an exceptional measure only to be taken during great crises or threats to national security and the Constitution itself. The potential threat could be anything, from communist insurgents to terrorists, earthquakes and tsunamis. In Hollywood fantasies, this would include also, of course, zombies. I'm referring here to Turner Clay's 2011 movie, State of Emergency, goes by that name. It is about the explosion of a chemical facility in a small American town. The explosion affected the population, who then mutated into flesh-eating zombies. The military was called in, and the hero, of course, worked from within the red zone to save the world. The message is simple. Good, young, non-smoking, healthy American male, be ready to defend your country. But if the state of emergency is considered as an exception, how about societies in Asia, where different forms of emergency rule have been in place for many years, and in some countries, in fact, has been the norm rather than the exception? I'm referring here to Malaysia, that was been under emergency rule from 1948 to 1960, and has then, after that, introduced the draconian Internal Security Act, which still, I think, applies until now. I mean, here in Singapore, too. Pakistan, for 5 times in their history. Philippines was under martial law 1972 until 1981. Taiwan was, as Guanxing mentioned earlier, under martial law for 40 years. Thailand also under military rule for several times, Hong Kong and India, and not to forget, of course, Burma, which has been under military rule for more than 50 years right now. And just yesterday, 2 days ago, in Egypt, the military ousted President Mohamed Morsi and installed a new emergency rule after having been under military rule for no less than 45 years. So, what I'm trying to say here that emergency rule is not a thing of the past. It is very much part of our present. In Indonesian history, different forms of emergency rule had been in place during the War of Independence from 45 to 49, and then after that the imposition of an official state of emergency in 1957 until 1963. And if you look at the new order itself under General Suharto, it was effectively a form of emergency rule. So the state of emergency in current debates is linked to the idea of normalcy. And it is in the question of normalcy that I am interested in. If emergency is contrasted to the ordinary course of events, then what are the ordinary course of events in a society that has been put under a prolonged state of emergency? What does the normal and the ordinary mean in such a context? This paper is largely based on my own experiences, having grown up in Indonesia during the New Order, and also based on my experience working with victims of state violence and their families for the last 15 years. But before I go into the question of normalcy and the ordinary, let me briefly outline the anatomy of emergency rule in Indonesia. In March 1957, Sukarno, under the pressure of the Indonesian army, declared the first official state of emergency to deal with the regional armed rebellions in Sumatra and Sulawesi. The law was revoked in 1963, only to be replaced by the draconian anti-subversion law, which was effective until the fall of Suharto in 1998. Some of my friends were brought to trial for violating this law and sent to prison for 13 years. When Suharto took power in 1965, after a failed plot to remove the army leadership, the authoritarian framework was already in place. What Suharto did was to restore and strengthen the colonial legacies of the state. Suharto's rise to power was accompanied by massive violence, killings, torture, and ill-treatment, detention, and imprisonment against hundreds of thousands alleged and real communists, left-wing nationalists, and other supporters of Sukarno's National Popular Coalition. The violence was unleashed by the Indonesian military and anti-communist civilian groups. In order to mobilize support, rumors were spread about alleged death lists, supposedly drawn up by communists, which listed names of people who would have been killed had the communists been able in taking power. The historian Ruth McVeigh used the term Great Fear, referring to the Great Fear in France during the Revolution in 1789. But while in France the peasants stormed manor houses out of fear of a feudal famine plot to starve the revolting population, in Indonesia it was a fear of communist plot to turn Indonesia into an atheist, totalitarian, communist state. But in a similar vein of action, rumors were spread about communists hoarding and piling up food supply, gold, and foreign currency in their houses. The fear of communism generated prolonged series of witch hunts, and I happen to document these witch hunts during the 1970s and 80s, which affected the entire society, including several people in the elite, including, for example, the vice president of Indonesia at that time, Sudarmono, who was allegedly a member of some socialist youth organization back in the 1940s. So these measures are used deliberately to repress political opposition and political rivalries. So the government warned the people continuously about the latent danger of communism and developed administrative measures to maintain the fear by requiring people to go through several tests to determine whether they are ideologically perceived clean, meaning not affiliated or influenced by communism. The extermination campaign against the communists was important in several respects. The emergency rule and the military-civilian coalition that grew out of the campaign was determined to oust Sukarno's National Popular Coalition and open the path for capitalist expansion and reintegrate the economy into the world system. In essence, it was a neo-colonial counter-revolution, to use the term of the day. In political terms, the New Order was essentially a police state with a vast network of political intelligence agencies. All branches of the armed forces had their own intelligence units. The Attorney General Office had the intelligence section, the Department of Internal Affairs, all had their own intelligence units and sections, sometimes with overlapping functions and authority. The structure was stretched from the top down to the lowest level. The military structure was entrenched with regional military commands down to the 6,500 sub-districts, staffed by an intelligence officer in every single station. And what do? I happened to get hold of some of these reports that the army abandoned in East Timor. And it's highly interesting, and in the sense that it's highly and extraordinarily boring. I was surprised to learn that each sub-district office has to produce around 5 or 6 pages of daily reports to the superiors, not to mention special reports on particular events. Here, a volleyball competition could be a particular special event that they have to report about. It was an ineffective and somewhat corrupt version of Bentham's panopticon, but it worked with a similar effect. Like the panopticon, it also organizes the distribution of bodies into several visible structures, particularly the neighborhood association, the RTRW, Rukun Tetangga and Rukun Warga, modeled after the Tunarigumi system during the World War, inherited from the Japanese occupation. And all of these structures were watched and guarded by groups composed of civilian, police, and military elements. And now they are called Kelompok Sadar Kamtipmas, that you are aware of the security and order of your own environment, which is a kind of an auxiliary police. Looking at the vast intelligence surveillance network, many scholars and activists argued that the New Order was essentially a panoptic state, where the bureaucracy overpowered people and produced a milieu in which feelings of disorientation and helplessness were widespread. In the end, it did not really matter if there really was a vast network or ever alert guards, because the gaze of the gods was already planted in the mind of the people. To quote Foucault, he who is subjected to a field of visibility and who knows it assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection. In other words, people become part of the panoptic machine. Rules and regulations are internalized and form the normativity, the oddness of thinking and behaving in certain ways. In most analysis of emergency rule, the focus was solely on the state. There has been a large literature about authoritarian states in the third world, including Indonesia. It was a trend back in the 1980s in Indonesia to write about state and society relationships, state and class, state and everything. Focusing on how hegemonic the state was, as if the state was an all-encompassing organism, and forgetting to ask a fundamental question. Was the state really that effective? In order to understand, we need to shift the attention from the state to the people. Shift the attention from the state archives and official documents, including human rights reports, to the observation of the everyday. Like Foucault's reading of Bentham's Panopticon, it doesn't really matter if there was a guard in the tower or not, because what mattered was the changing subjectivity of the prisoners. And to the prisoners, or the people of Indonesia, that I now will turn to. In the early years of the regime, fear of death and loss, often referred as primal fears in psychology, was widespread across the population. With the indiscriminate killings of people, including elderly people and children from all sections of society, from poor peasant, farmer, fisherfolk up to army officers, the fear affected the entire population. People who knew that they were targeted went into hiding, discarded their identities, renounced their past, and in some cases betrayed their comrades and took part in the witch hunt itself. Rumors were rampant and pitted against the anxiety of the unknown. Who was going to be next was the question of the day. Along with the killings, there was an erosion of public values. Constitutional rights, basic human rights, the right to life, were simply abandoned, and even basic primary social bonds were violated. I heard stories about people who were forced to kill their own siblings, parents, and so on. So all these social bonds were practically destroyed. The state was arbitrary and brutal and created uncertainty, self-doubt, and insecurity, which resulted in the atomization of society, a situation where no one trusts each other, where the society is turned into an agglomeration of nameless persons, which Ali Topo, who was the great architect of the New Order, called the floating mass. So it was really part of a plan to create a population that was totally apolitical, has no sense of direction other than the ones that are determined by the state. From the interviews that I made in the last 15 years, the situation was said to come back to normal in the early 1970s, when the communist threat was overcome. The killing stopped in 1968, and the New Order introduced the ambitious grand plan of development, financed almost entirely by the oil boom and international capital. So you had the Green Revolution back in the 1970s, which transformed the rural areas into large food and cash crop sites. You have the expansion of the public sector, the industrial sector, and so on, which led to the creation of thousands of jobs, increased consumption, and the formation of a new urban middle class. So after the self-reliant policy of Sukarno, Indonesia was reintegrated into the national market. For many people, life was back to normal. But what it meant was not a return to the natural order of things, but a newly established social and economic order. Normalcy is, after all, a product of human culture. It's not given. In this context, being normal was a strategic choice to engage in actions for survival in rapidly changing environments. It is interesting to look at the idea of normalcy here a bit closer. Normalcy rests on the distinction between the usual and the unusual, between the ordinary and the extraordinary. In political terms, this means a distinction between the grand events of history with a capital H and the small and insignificant events of the past. Being ordinary means staying away from the great and important things in history and assuming less, or if possible, no responsibility whatsoever for what happened. The problem was that one can try to forget history, but history will linger on in different forms, like in the form of questions from your nephews about the missing uncle, or the sudden revelation of one's secret identity. I happen to know a man who has hid his real identity, even from his own family, his wife. They didn't know until 1998, when everyone came to the surface and then declared that they were detained once, etc., and the family was shot. So, and this is still happening now. I mean, there are still people who are working out, trying to deal with the past, and then with their own families and friends. So, in most cases, people would resort to silence and continue to run a double life. In the underground, in the gutter of pain and shame, as ex-political prisoners or children of communists, and the normal life at the surface. Okay. Obscurity becomes an important cultural strategy of denying reality. You don't want others to know about your past, but you certainly want them to know that it is difficult or almost impossible to talk about it. Hence, the common phrases during interviews like, "Nggak jelas," it is unclear what happened to my family. Or, "Nggak tahu," I don't know what happened. Yeah? Or, "Nggak enak," it's unpleasant. Yeah? Let's not talk about it. So we continue to get these kinds of reactions. At glance, this may look like a case of simple political opportunism. Everybody wants to save their own skin, which is normal, right? But while in some cases this might be true, but I also see that these practices are driven by the lack of basic principles and values on which one could hold. Something is nggak jelas, or unclear, not because there is a lack of logical coherence, but simply because there is an absence of an authority that would validate the statement situation. And this is what emergency rule is all about, the absence of principles and values other than the ones imposed by the sovereign, in this case the military regime, at will. Emergency rule is highly arbitrary. People depend on the words of the ruler instead of a set of agreed principles. So whatever the sovereign or the ruler says, then this is what you follow. For those who've been in Benghwat's class in sociology, I think it's a similar situation like that. He is the only one who knows what the answer is. Is he in the room? So this strategy of silence was facilitated in the 1970s with the expansion of capitalist modernity, which allowed people to lead a normal life, to have a regular job, earn money, form a family, grow old, and retire. Consumption became the basis of normalcy. I once asked the son of a former political prisoner of his consumptive habits, which I think are a little bit excessive, and to which he replied, "Saya bosan miskin, I'm tired of being poor." The fear of loss and poverty was sublimated into consumption as a sign of abundance. The 1980s was probably the peak period of the New Order. The student movement was curbed by the normalization of campus life, that was the official term that the regime used, by political corporatism. Corporatism was on the rise with the formation of state-sponsored unions and mass movements. The state itself became reified despite the corruption and its well-known incompetence. I once happened to read an intelligence report. Unfortunately, my name was in it, and was unbelievably stupid, in the sense that they made the student movement much more coherent than it actually was, right? So they say it like that, many things. I won't go into the details. But the reverse is also true. People render the state as a unified set of institutions. In Gestalt psychology, this is called the law of pregnance, in which the mind perceives objects as a whole even when they are not complete. The state therefore lives in the perception of the people, which according to Foucault is the ultimate effect of the panopticon. I will jump to the end, if time allows that, about resistance and alternatives, what we have been doing in the last 15 years in trying to cope with the legacies of the New Order. If the above discussion conveyed a sense of helplessness, in the last part of the paper, I will discuss the question of resistance under the emergency rule of the New Order. It is interesting to note that the political resistance against the New Order had been almost uninterrupted since the late 1960s, except for the early 1980s when the regime was at the peak of its power. In 1998, the resistance culminated in the massive protest movement, which forced Suharto to step down. Political changes have taken place ever since, but the legacies of the New Order still lingered on, and there is little that the social movements, including human rights groups, had to offer. New approaches are needed, and I would argue that a careful reading of the culture of fear and its legacy would help people to find some right questions to address. I think fear has to be included in the political agenda. Our cultural and political imagination now has been dominated by it instead of hope, and I think it should be reversed. Demonstrations should be organized not to force the government to bring the perpetrators to trial, but to reduce atomization of the society, which has cultivated fear for decades. Mass gatherings should not only be a display of power, but reasserting of humanity, confronting terror and fear by demonstrating care and concern. Information campaigns should not be directed solely to mobilize support from the outside, but more importantly, to overcome the sense of uncertainty. We should not let fear to overtake the cultural and political imagination of today. And before this will turn into a real political speech, I will stop here. Thank you.